There are a few things that will make cooking a real pleasure, and one of them is learning how to sharpen a knife properly. Using a sharp knife makes all the difference, and it's very, very infrequent that I find sharp knives in home kitchens. The reality is that people are intimidated to sharpen knives because they just don't know how, but once you get the knack of it, it's really simple. So I want to demonstrate basically how to sharpen a knife properly. So there are a couple of different tools when it comes to sharpening a knife. Oftentimes we'll see something that looks like this, which is a honing steel, or something like this, which is a honing steel that's called a diamond steel. So basically, here's what you've got. You've got this knife, right? And at the very edge of the knife, it comes together like this. As we cut with it, the point that's the thinnest, where the two edges of the angle meet, it dulls and rounds, because you can imagine that, you know, you've been knocking away at this kind of sharp bit until it's kind of dull like this, or it's kind of crooked and craggedy. If the thin part is crooked and craggedy like this, you take it and on a honing steel, you run your knife at the angle that you would like the steel to realign to, back and forth. You see fancy chefs kind of going like this. What they're really doing is just slowly sliding the knife down the steel at the proper angle to realign it. That works really, really well if you started with a sharp knife and you just need to kind of give it a little touch up. A diamond steel is a great tool because it actually grinds some of the steel away, whereas the regular steel just aligns the craggedy edges. The diamond steel will physically grind it just like you would a stone. The problem with this is that it takes a lot more of the knife away because it's actually grinding a bit of the metal away. And also, if you don't do it at the right angle, you can actually make it worse. But you use the exact same process to sharpen the knife on the diamond steel as you would with a regular steel, but it can be a little bit more aggressive and you can actually grind some of the knife. So most people when you buy a knife set, most people have one of these, and they're great for keeping up a knife, keeping it sharp on a daily basis. The problem is that at a certain point, your knife actually gets so dull that instead of it just kind of being misaligned and needing to be straightened up, it might actually be rounded off, at which point you need to grind some of these curved pieces away and make it sharp again. And in order to do that, you really need a sharpening stone, and you need the proper technique to use a sharpening stone. So the idea here is that I'm going to grind the knife at a specific angle, and the most important piece of the puzzle is that I want to keep this angle. I don't know if can you see the edge of the knife that's got some chips in it? And so the goal for me is that I want to regrind at the right angle the entire blade, and I want to get rid of all of those chips. So I love this stone. It's a king stone that I bought from Corinne. Corinne is pretty much the best knife store. They have an incredible website, www.corinne.com, where you can buy all types of expensive, fancy, Japanese knives and tools. And they also have stuff like, great sharpening stones for $30 that'll do the trick. When we're thinking about sharpening knives with sharpening stone, there are two basic types of stones. There are water stones and there are oil stones. A stone is literally a rock, either natural or composite, that has a certain grit or parts per square inch that are going to actually grind away a little bit of the metal and align it back to its kind of point. The reason a knife is sharp is because actually the metal comes to a point at its very edge. The oil stones are coated with oil, and the oil helps lubricate the surface, which takes the metal particles and whisks them away so they don't, clog the pores of the stone. A water stone does the same thing with water. Water stones and oil stones are pretty much interchangeable. I prefer water stones because the only thing you need is water. You don't have to have a specialty oil in order to use them. So in the kind of Western style, what you do is you hold the stone this way, oriented kind of like in the landscape orientation. It's a water stone, so I've soaked it in water. And I have a little bit of extra water that I can kind of pour on top. And what people do is they start on one end, and you just slide the knife from one end to the other, and then you go in the other direction back. And you start on one end, and then the other. One end, and then the other. The way I prefer to sharpen a knife is the Japanese style. Is you hold the knife, you keep the stone facing perpendicular to yourself rather than parallel, and you put two fingers on the edge of the blade, and you're going to push down as you slide up and rotate down the knife and ultimately you're able to more specifically grind individual pieces. So I'm literally going up, pressing down, pulling down, moving my fingers up, sliding down, moving my fingers up, sliding down, moving my fingers up, sliding down. And I'm doing this at the same angle until I basically reach the beginning of the curve where the knife starts to curve up, at which point if you see my right elbow, I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to go towards me. And if you look at the very edge where the knife is meeting the stone, as I pick my arm up and move it forward, it rotates around. And so if I do that at the same time as I'm sliding up, I can hit those individual points on the knife and maintain that same curve. The speed doesn't really matter. The speed comes in time. It's really, you want to make sure that you're holding a consistent angle, right? Because every time I grind it, I'm trying to grind a flat line. So I want my knife is kind of like this, and then I want it to be flat to the edge in order to be sharp. I can't afford it to be kind of wobbly. So I want to make sure that I'm holding the knife at a consistent angle. So ideally, if I've soaked my stone long enough, it's not going to dry up, and there are constantly going to be water on top, which is pulling the particles of metal that are shaving off by the stone away. And they make lots of different grits of stone. They have 80 grit, 120 grit, 200, 600. This happens to be a 6,000 stone. It's super, super fine. It's called a polishing stone for getting a mirror finish on it. And basically, 1,000 is, this is a 1,000. Anything less than 1,000 is going to be really, really rough, which means it's going to grind a lot of the steel away. It's really better for repairing a knife if you've got a big break and you need to grind it quickly. But it takes so much of the steel off of the knife that it can be kind of dangerous, especially for a beginner. 1,000 grit stone is a really great versatile medium grit that's great for sharpening most knives most of the time. And then anything kind of higher than that is really for polishing. So, you know, if you want to move really quickly and you don't have the time, you can use start with 800, then 1,000, then 1,200, then 6,000. The reality is, if you just have 1,000 grit stone, that'll work perfectly for almost anything you need to do. They also have composite stones that have kind of two sides. They'll have really fine on one side and a little bit rougher on the other. Those are really great if you're only going to have one stone and you want to have a polishing stone. But for me, I think it's kind of better to have individual stones of the individual amount, especially because every time you use a stone, you wear a tiny bit of it away. And if you're like me and you sharpen your knives every day, you can run through a stone, and it's nice to have a nice big thick stone that's going to last you a long time. So here's the deal. The more dull your knife is, or the longer between sharpenings, the more uses between sharpenings, the more difficult it's going to be, because the more dull it's actually going to be and the more you're going to have to grind it. So if you use your knives every day, taking the time to just hone them and sharpen them kind of on a weekly basis is going to maintain that edge and be a lot easier than if you never sharpen it and then once every 6 months, you know, have to really redo the entire edge, which can take a long time. I'm just rinsing the stone. So I've got some metal particles and some of the stone that's kind of created maybe a thin clay that helps to lubricate but can actually clog up. So every now and then I want to rinse my stone and start with fresh water again. So basically I've ground one side here. And if I feel with my fingers, I can actually, rubbing up in this direction, I can actually feel a little bit of the steel has been pushed over to that side. So every time as I sharpen it, I'm actually pushing the steel at the very sharpest point over to one side. And at that point, when I can start to feel that burr or a little tiny edge on that side. And at that point, it's time to switch over because I know that I've actually sharpened down until I've hit the edge. If you can imagine, if your knife is kind of like this, rounded off like this, as you start to sharpen, you're really just hitting this side here, but you're never going to hit here until you've kind of ground all that away. And at a certain point, when it's completely flat, as you're sliding down, you're just kind of coming off, and just the edge has a little burr on the outside. And that's what I can feel from this angle, and that's when I'm going to switch to the other side and start to sharpen the other side. Going from this side to this side. So I'm sliding my fingers up as I'm sliding the knife back and forth to catch different parts of the edge as I'm going. So I'm starting in the bottom and pushing down, and I'm pushing down with these fingers and pushing up with this. So this guy is holding the angle, this guy is pushing straight down, and I'm just only sharpening the little bit of the knife that's right under my fingers. And once I've kind of honed so that both sides are touching, so that when I push on this side there's a burr, and then when I go to this side and do it back on this side, now I feel the burr on this edge. At that point, I've now matched, and both of the sides are hitting, and I'm just going this side, this side. So now I'm just kind of grinding flat, at which point what I want to do is back to this Western style. I'm just going to kind of at a slightly more angle cut that burr off. And actually, a great way to tell if a knife is sharp, you see people doing this all the time, and when you are kind of experienced and have a feeling for it, you can tell whether the knife is sharp by sliding your fingers up and feeling it catch. If you have a little less experience, a great safe way is on your fingernail. So you can actually see, it catches because it's actually cutting into my fingernail. Whereas here, it's just kind of sliding along and shaving a bit of my fingernail. It's not quite as sharp. Up here, maybe same, not quite as sharp. So you can feel where the knife is the most sharp. Another way to do it is, and you get tired of this because you lose all the hair on your arm, but like you can see some hair on your arm, and you can just kind of slide the knife, and you can see that it's shaving the hairs off of my hand. So you know it's sharp because it's like razor sharp. It's a little gross. Fair enough? And that's how you sharpen a knife. Now I'm going to go ahead and just use the fine stone and polish it. And actually, so now that I've kind of shaved my arm and I'm never going to get laid again, because I've got, well, maybe I'll just tell people I'm a bicycle racer. All for the foodie people out there. Now that we've sharpened the knife, you can also see that at that very edge where it was really chipped, the chips are no longer there. And what I want to see, if I'm examining it really carefully, is that the edge of the knife, width of that edge, is exactly the same from top to bottom. And at this point, now that I've kind of sharpened it with that really fine stone, you can see that if I try and slide it down my fingernail, it catches the entire way. So that's how I know it's going to be razor sharp from top to bottom. You see all the hair just falling off there? I'm hairless. I'm like a baby seal. That's how you sharpen a knife. And that's how you shave your hand. Jesus, why'd I do that? Look at my whole hand. I'm gonna go wash myself. Be sure to like and subscribe, check us on Instagram, and download the Project Foodie app on the iOS App Store.